All right, in this video, I wanted to go over how training is going and sort of what this week of training is meant to do. So this is going to be basically my week 3 before my week 4, and this is when I would take what I call the anchor points on my third week of training, going into my week 4, which is basically going to be the lightest amount of weight that I can take to feel ready for my week 4 weight. So this was about 90% of my goal weight going into week 4, which was 529, and I'm hoping to be able to do 578 for my week 4 for set of 4, in RPE of 7. And the reason why this is important is because you don't want to overly fatigue yourself going into your last week of training. You want it basically just the right amount of weight that you need to in order to build your baseline up so that you're strong enough to hit a PR on week 4 or whatever rep range that you are using. Joe is using this as sort of my lightest week of or my lightest block of training is sort of, get some good momentum going, touch just heavy enough of weight where we can start, really ramping things up into heavier blocks, but really just keeping things a little bit easier. So that is sort of what I am doing there. Now I wanted to talk a little bit about my accessory programming and why I'm only really doing 2 sets per exercise, as you guys will see here. So this is really due to the concept of diminishing returns as you continue doing each exercise. So you can think about it like this. On your first set of each exercise that you're doing, you're getting 100% of the effectiveness of that rep and not a lot of fatigue. As you keep doing more and more sets, that kind of cuts down in half. So say you do, your second set, it's only half as effective as far as stimulative, and then you're also getting much more like the fatigue. Fatigue goes linearly up with each set that you're doing, and then you do 3 sets, and maybe it's only 25% of the effect of that set, etc. And this is also sort of similar in regards to workout volume that you're doing, as far as stimulus to fatigue for muscle growth. The more volume that you do, you're generating more and more fatigue per session, relative to the the muscle growth stimulus that you are getting. And this is also partially why I bias slightly a little more towards a little bit higher training frequencies. So, 2 to 3 times a week for one muscle group, and splitting the volume up because it's going to generally, lead to slightly better muscle growth and potentially better strength gains. This is especially what you see in at bench press. Bench press seems to respond uniquely well to higher frequencies. But this is sort of what I do with my overall accessory programming. I do it a lot for a lot of my clients in general. Is because especially if they have the ability to actually push intensity, which is something that you're going to learn how to do better as you get more and more advanced. You typically just you can't do as much volume and recover from it because you're able to drive that much more of a stimulus to the muscle. So, for example, like when you're a beginner, because you're not as skilled at it, you're just not able to really push that close to failure. It's similar to really any other skill, right? If you are not really good at doing any task, you're going to be kind of apprehensive about it and ease your way into it. Versus if you're really good at it, you're going to be much more confident and much more able to actually push closer to your true limits. And that's kind of how it goes when you get to be beginner, intermediate, advanced. Beginners typically can tolerate a little more higher training volumes because they're not strong. They're not as good at pushing themselves up close to failure. Intermediates are a little bit better at it, so they get away with a little bit. They don't need as much volume. And advanced need even less. And I'm advanced right now, and so and my ability to really drive stimulus is quite high. So I've really had to cut back on what I'm doing as far as volume goes to really make sure that I'm able to drive some muscle growth, while still being able to make progress on my squat, bench, and deadlift. And this is where sort of programming can become a little bit tricky at times because we want to be able to have enough muscle growth stimulus in our program, but we don't want to have that really interfere with our squat, bench, and deadlift progression. So, kind of the question I ask myself when I'm creating a program for a client is what is the minimal amount of squat, bench, and deadlift volume I can do to drive an intensity stimulus on that lift, and then how much sort of skill do they need? How many skill slots do you need? Which basically I would say sub RPE 6 work. Is what I would call strength skill work. And then I would keep track of how many heavier sets do we need that are going to actually drive more that neurological adaptation and sort of fill in the gap with stimulus as far as intensity goes. Of hard sets with accessory work. And that's sort of how I conceptualize things. And most of my clients ended up between 8 to 12 hard sets per week, not counting the skill work they do for SBD. So sort of how I think about accessory programming, what I do personally, and then how anchor points sort of work. And you can use them to help set yourself up for APR. Usually you're going to be anywhere between 90 to 93% of your goal weight. But yeah, sort of an easier block. This block, still going to be setting an ability PR,
All right,
and
so this part of the video, I wanted to just give some practical application as to how I would conceptualize training volume. Just looking at squat here, just to make things a little bit quicker. As far as how I would conceptualize training volume and how it relates to overall weekly volume needed for a very strong lifter, for example, to make progress. Bridger is a very strong 148, 67 kilo lifter. He squats, like 475. He benches 275, and he deadlifts 300 kilos, so 661 pounds. So he's very strong. But I want to sort of break down how I would conceptualize his program and how I would think about tracking volume, because basically there's going to be three sort of aspects of strength. And strength is multifactorial. There's the actual neurological gains that are just going to be a component of like the actual heavy weights, and then sort of the skill components of lifting. So your ability to coordinate, remember things. That's a large portion of why we have down sets, is that strength skill aspect of things. I would argue that down sets in powerlifting, if they're not very heavy, they're not doing that much, because we do know that proximity to failure is very important for strength, or sorry, for muscle growth. And it's less about proximity to failure for strength. It's like there's a certain intensity threshold, which is roughly about 70% is what the research says. I will say, as you get stronger and the load gets more fatiguing, I've even seen down to like 60% work. So it depends on the person, but in general, like that's what I would look at. And then there's also going to be hypertrophy, so muscle growth stimulus. Now we need to balance all these out so that we're not having too little hypertrophy stimulus. We're not able to build muscle or even atrophy, or we want to have enough actual top end practice where we're actually driving that neurological adaptation. And so usually in my programming, I'm going to look at everything that's like sort of like the top set or the heaviest set of the day, or anything that's going to be RPE 6 and up as going to be a a strength stimulus. Anything that's below that is not doing that much. It's different in the sense of like RP5 on this day is still doing something as far as a strength stimulus, but usually just looking at top sets. So I guess that's how I would say it. So if you look at his volume, he has basically 2 heavier sets on his squat per week. So, and usually that's what I'm going to see. It's going to be anywhere between like in general like 2 to 4 hard sets per week per lift. So if we're looking at for as far as a strength stimulus, so weekly volume has 2 for a strength stimulus. Now, as far as a skill practice stimulus, obviously this is going to be a part of that, but I'm just going to count separately just for the sake of things. This is mostly going to be more of his skill stimulus, because it's not going to be super hard. Like if I wanted to basically have this set be equally as hard, drive some sort of other strength adaptation, I would have this be more like a 9% load drop down, and so that would basically be a little bit more like in that intensity zone. But I'm trying to basically manage that where he's not going to be things aren't too heavy, so you can have good strength skill practice. So he has 3 on his primary day, and then he has 2 on his secondary day. So across he has 5 for skill, and then for hypertrophy, he's going to be having roughly about 4 slots for that. And so this is usually what you'll see in most strength programs, that someone is mostly looking at driving hypertrophy or driving strength. I'm going to keep their accessory volume on the lower side of things. So as far as the hypertrophy stimulus, it's usually going to be around 4 to 6 sets per week. Because if we have too high of like a hypertrophy stimulus, too much muscle damage, that is going to interfere with our ability to really drive strength on the main lift, since specificity is important. But that's for an example of like Bridger. You can see right there, he fits into that. He's making great strength gains, and he is also likely still growing. Now, is it as fast as probably could? No, but if he wanted to get to be a little bit more of a hypertrophy focused block, quote unquote, I would just replace some of these skill slots with hypertrophy slots. So, and basically ask myself, what's like the bare minimum that he needs. So, maybe instead of doing on this one day, we do, all these down sets. I would just do maybe 2 sets and then replace that with this leg press volume. So if you were to do that, maybe it's like this is like a strength phase. I would still want to keep that strength stimulus in there since that's important to practice. But I would drop down his skill stimulus to maybe 2 sets, and maybe interchange that with going up to 7 sets. Again, I would maybe only do 2 sets here, and then I would add in another set of like extensions. That's an example of how you can conceptualize things. And in general, you look at the total volume he's doing here. We're looking at 11 sets, and usually we're going to be looking at 8 to 12 hard sets per week, or sets per week in general. Lifters can tolerate and still drive good stimulus. Bench press can be an exception. Like I've seen, like even like myself, like I'll do a little bit more than that. But in general, like this is where most lifters are going to fall into. And I don't think that unless you really need more of the skill practice, like you don't need a ton. But it depends on what you are going for. But that's sort of how I would change things, from like strength phase. And like I do think of things like this too. By the way, I think that block periodization has a place. I think that like you have to just change focuses, right? Like you can't just power build forever. It drives too much overall systemic fatigue to drive the actual adaptation that you theoretically need to maximize your strength gains, and then also to drive that adaptation to drive most hypertrophy gains. Like you run into overall just issues where you're not really growing a lot, for muscle growth, and you're not gaining much strength because systemic fatigue is limiting you. And if systemic fatigue is too high, you are going to plateau and even regress and get hurt. So, yeah. Hopefully that made sense. If you guys have any questions, ask below.